How do you identify a Jewish optimist? It's someone who thinks that things can't get any worse. We Jews love to complain. We complained most of our way through the book of Numbers. Moses, our greatest prophet and teacher in today's Parsha, says to the people, Gam bi hit'anaf Hashem biglalchem. God was angry with me because of you. And that's why I don't get to go to the promised land. Blaming, complaining. We kvetch in the desert. We kvetch in Eretz Yisrael, in the shtetl, on a boat, with a goat. Even Moses, our greatest prophet and teacher, kvetches. Michael Wex wrote a book about Yiddish culture called Born to Kvetch. I watched the documentary When Jews Were Funny on Amazon Prime recently. The basic claim seemed to be that the root of Jewish humor is complaining. Now, I'm not saying that kvetching isn't funny. It can be hilarious. And I'm not saying Jews don't have what to complain about. We've got plenty. But I wonder about the cost. Years ago, I got a rubber bracelet. You remember when those were in vogue? That had the words, don't blame, don't complain. And then a citation from Pirkei Avot, which leads to Ezahu Ashir, who is rich, Hasameach Bechalko, the one who is content with their lot. The bracelet came with an exercise. Every time you catch yourself complaining or blaming someone else, switch the bracelet to the other wrist. I don't want to admit just how often I had to do this, but I will tell you that after several days wearing it, I complained less. And after several weeks wearing it, I felt happier, more content, less caught up on all the little indignities and disappointments of life. Kvetching and projecting are fine in small doses as indulgences, as catharsis for a people who have endured much real trauma. But blame is also toxic. And at a certain decibel level, blaming can become almost indistinguishable from hate. Blame is, of course, at the core of hatred, especially the strain of hatred known as anti-Semitism. Maybe you've been monitoring the rise in anti-Semitism in the US these past several years. Verbal attacks, defacement of property and gravestones, other hate crimes, mass murder. Maybe you've watched fellow Beth Ammer David Simon's Plot Against America and have been thinking about contingency plans when Trump's secret police show up to Baltimore in unmarked vans. Maybe you've been dismayed these past several weeks at anti-Semitic images and tropes expressed by celebrities or politicians who seem to have little appreciation for the gravity of their comments and tweets, or others who seem to know, well, exactly what they're doing. I want to be clear about one thing. Arguments about what kind of anti-Semitism is worse don't impress me. Left-wing, right-wing anti-Semitism, white supremacists, or black activists, Pittsburgh, Poway, New Jersey, the order of magnitude varies to be sure, but the communicable virus, the ancient pandemic that is Jew hatred, always comes down to one thing. It is our fault and not theirs. This is Shabbat Hazon. So I want to say a word about Tisha B'Av, our national day of Jewish mourning, which begins this Wednesday night. Because the liturgy of Tisha B'Av is also about assigning blame. What's the thrust of Eicha, of Lamentations? It is our fault and not theirs. What's the Talmud's assessment? Who destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE? The Babylonians. Whose fault was it? Ours. We were worshiping idols. Who destroyed the second temple in 70 CE? The Romans. Whose fault was it? Ours. We were engaged in rampant sinat chinam, causeless hatred. What about more modern sources? The 20th century Slonimer Rebbe, in his Netivot Shalom, makes the seemingly radical claim that perhaps we should not grieve so much for the fallen temples, for what is past. He equates sadness, etzev, with atzav, which is one of the words for idolatry. Joy is a critical feature of Hasidic thought, so it makes sense that a Hasidic master would be concerned about wallowing in sadness. But he still prescribes fasting and abstinence on Tisha B'Av. Why? Because the temple is not rebuilt, because Israel is not fully restored, because we are sinners. Whose fault is it? Ours, once again. I think a lot about the pathology of Tisha B'Av, about this approach to theodicy which amounts to self-blame, blaming the victims of oppression and even taken to its extreme genocidal violence. If anti-Semitism is rooted in scapegoating, in blaming us as a people for other people's ills, then what about self-blame? I want to say it's problematic, and I also want to say I think there's an opportunity here to distinguish between two different types of self-blame. One which ought to be understood, and then, for the most part, I think rejected as a theological approach to Judaism. Another which may be useful, but to a point. So, one type of self-blame is what I'll call the first temple type. We were idolaters, so we deserve to have our people slaughtered and displaced, robbed of our political sovereignty. That's the root of a certain strain of Jewish humor, the kvetchy, angsty kind, where comedians joke about how Jews aren't athletic, for example, against really all evidence to the contrary. Or we celebrate our dissatisfaction with the world. A man is sitting in a train station saying over and over again, "Boy, am I thirsty. Boy, am I thirsty." Maybe you've heard this one. After several minutes, another man in the station tires of his complaining, hearing over and again, "Boy, am I thirsty. Boy, am I thirsty." So he walks to a water cooler and he fills a paper cup and he brings it over to the man. The man takes the cup, doesn't say anything, drinks the water, puts down the cup, and about a minute later, he begins to say, "Boy, was I thirsty. Boy, was I thirsty." But this type of self-blame lends itself to a kind of malignancy where, like cancer cells and healthy ones, we attack our fellow Jews. Like the time I sat in a Chabad rabbi's house in Jerusalem and he told me over Shabbos dinner, no less, that Reform Judaism was to blame for the Holocaust. This is the true danger of Eicha's theology, at least understood in certain ways, that we will extrapolate God's disfavor in one moment to God's disfavor in all moments of Jewish suffering. What is the antidote to this type of self-blame? Well, it's some version of the mantra that I discussed earlier. It's to complain less, it's to blame less, to be more content with what we have as a gift from God who loves us, all of us, and doesn't abandon us, and to reread and recontextualize even biblical texts that we find problematic. To be clear, this doesn't mean that everything is always okay. Look at Jewish history. No one is saying Jews should have been accepting of anti-Semitic policies that limited our access to certain neighborhoods or universities. No one is saying that we should sit quietly when college students are verbally assaulted for the crime of traveling to Israel. Saying we're not to blame for the destruction of the first temple is to say it was the Babylonians who did that. Being less self-deprecating, paradoxically, means assigning blame where it actually belongs. Instead of blaming Reform Jews for the Shoah, guess what? Blame the Nazis. But the second type of self-blame, while risky too, can be a bulwark, I think, against the first type. When the rabbis teach that the second temple was destroyed because of causeless hatred, they aren't saying our problem was that we abandoned God. They're saying we fell short of our obligations to one another. The Talmud in Masechet Yoma explains that the sin of wanton hatred is equivalent to the three severe transgressions: idol worship, incest, and murder. According to this line of thinking, the rabbi who said such terrible things to me wasn't the solution to Jewish suffering. He is one possible cause of Jewish suffering. The Talmud, in a different tractate, in Masechet Gittin, claims the temple was destroyed because of the hardening of Jewish hearts toward one another. Jerusalem was destroyed, it says, on account of a kamsa and a bar kamsa. There was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa, and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go bring my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy, Bar Kamsa. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. The host said to Bar Kamsa, "You are my enemy. What then do you want here? Arise and leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "Since I have already come, let me stay and I will give you money. For whatever I drink, do not embarrass me by sending me away." You see, Bar Kamsa thought that he had received an invitation to the party and that the host actually wanted to make peace. But the host said to him, "No, you must leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "I will give you money for half of the feast. Just do not send me away." The host said to him, "No, you must leave." Bar Kamsa then said to him, "I will give you money for the entire feast. Just let me stay." The host said to him, "No." Finally, the host took Bar Kamsa by the hand, stood him up, and kicked him out. After having been cast out from the feast, Bar Kamsa said to himself, "Since the sages were sitting there at this party," that is, the leaders, the religious leaders of the community, "and did not protest, it appears that they were in agreement with what was done. I will therefore go and inform against them to Caesar." As I said, there is some risk in this approach as well. Think of how many Jews blame us for causing anti-Semitism. Fran Drescher whines too much. That's why people hate Jews. Bibi's politics are too toxic. That's why people hate Jews. Ashanda Lagoyim, they say. What would they think of us? Chevra, let's not fall into that trap. When people hate us as a people, it is never our fault. Full stop. And hating each other is also a problem. Selling each other out has happened throughout our history and in this time period. Weaponizing our enemies against those who ought to be our friends, that causes Jewish suffering too. We Jews, like so many people who carry generational trauma, attack each other far too often. I can't tell you geopolitically if Jews hating Jews weakened us enough to be vulnerable to the Romans. I suspect not. I suspect the Romans were always too strong. But is there a lesson to be learned from self-blame type 2 about the dangers of blaming ourselves, of blaming one another, or hating one another? You bet. And just as there is an antidote to the first type, there's an antidote to this one as well. This antidote comes from Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, the first chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine, or the Ashkenazi first chief rabbi, rather. Rav Kook said, if we were destroyed and the world with us due to sinat chinam, that is causeless hatred, we will return to being rebuilt, and the world with us due to avat chinam, that is causeless love. The inverse of hate is love. The inverse of blame is accountability, as we've seen. Blame and hate are twins, but love and accountability are also twins. That's why 2 verses of chapter 19 of Vayikra read as follows: "You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Hocheach tocheach et amitecha, rather rebuke your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Don't hate, rebuke. Don't blame, love. This love of accountability is the love Congressman John Lewis represented. His devotion to nonviolence didn't mean he was unwilling to fight. He was always getting into good trouble, quote unquote, and encouraged others to do the same. And this love of accountability was on full display this week when another U.S. representative stood on the House floor and rebuked her colleague for the vulgarity and pettiness of his attacks with forceful clarity and surprising grace. Tisha B'Av is coming. We will sit on the floor, on our own floors, if we're able, on the Zoom camera, with our candles, our flashlights. We'll chant the solemn words of Echa and contemplate our historic moments of powerlessness and ways we sometimes exacerbate that impotence with self-blame and even self-loathing. And we'll mourn the myriad injustices foisted upon our people and other peoples by those who hate and blame and hate. And we'll look at ourselves and make sure we are not among those who blame and hate, giving our enemies and the enemies of all difference additional victories. And then the day will end, and we will rise. And 6 days later, we'll encounter another day on the Jewish calendar, one positioned, I think, perfectly to remind us of the best response to Sinat Chinam, causeless hatred. What lesser-known occasion is celebrated on the 15th of Av, on Tu B'Av? Well, that is the Jewish holiday of love. Shabbat Shalom.